it's scarcely credible that it's a decade ago that Edward Said died. Though Columbia, despite being the least cloistered of great universities, was really too small for the outsized scope of his intellectual and political passions and his Olympian personality, Columbia mattered to him a great deal, and it was really partly our awareness of that which made us all so dependent on his presence. I'm not sure how we've managed these last 10 years, probably not very well, but we're trying, and it helps greatly to keep his memory alive with a lecture over an evening each year by a person of real distinction and courage and substance. Raja Shehadeh is conspicuously all these things, and we are tremendously privileged to have him with us this evening. I'll ask Edward's son Wadir to say a few words about Raja, since he knows him well, and because I know that he will speak with personal feeling. But before I do, let me just say a word about Wadir, who is himself a young man of courage and distinction and substance, a professor of law who's becoming increasingly well known in his special field of the law surrounding the prosecution of terrorists, and whose fine book on the subject will be published by Oxford University Press in a few months. Wadir got his undergraduate degree from Princeton and then studied the law here at Columbia. Though I have to tell you, Wadir, that I really only would hear about you from Edward in tones that expressed both annoyance and admiration about having been thrashed by you in a tennis game, and in fact unalloyed annoyance about your teenage taste in music. Of all the reasons, it would be wonderful to have had Edward around us, with us today. Not least would be the fierce pride he would feel in Wadir's academic achievements. So, Wadir, we're all very proud of you, and I'll ask you now to come and introduce Raja.
Thank you all so much for being here. It really is my great honor this time around to present this year's Edward Said Lecture, Raja Shehadeh, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of my father's passing. I'll let that sink in for a second, at least for me. I cannot really do justice to Raja's amazing series of accomplishments and stances, but I feel I must try. So it was back in the summer of 1992, during my father's first trip back to Palestine since 1947, and that was my first trip ever there, when my father came to me and said, "Look, you're going to meet one of Palestine's most important lawyers. Raja Shehadeh, the man he was talking about, is the individual who first laid bare the mind-numbingly arbitrariness of the occupation regime in his pioneering study, Occupier's Law. Also introduced the world to the concept of sumud, also translated as steadfastness. I have a bit of a quibble with that translation, because it also means sort of standing tall, standing up for what you believe. This concept of sumud in the context of the Palestinian struggle, that was Raja. You say you want to go to law school, Wadir, he said. Well, this is the person you must meet. And from there, I made sure to acquaint myself with Raja's work, of course. And I was also fortunate enough to become acquainted with Raja and his wife, Penny, and became good friends with them as well. Raja was someone with whom I consulted as I navigated through law school and then later on in my legal career. He helped introduce me to professional Palestinian society, arranging for me to work as a law clerk at his own family law firm during one of my summers in law school, a great experience, one of the great professional experiences of my life. It was only later that I truly began to understand the import of his own work and legacy on the Palestinian landscape, both legal and otherwise. He helped establish, I think as many of you know, one of the Arab world's first and most enduring human rights organizations, Al-Haq, which is affiliated with the International Commission of Jurists, which to this day retains its effectiveness and relevance in the Palestinian and Arab arena. He also served as a legal advisor to the Palestinian delegation in its ill-fated, I guess they're all ill-fated, but the ill-fated negotiations with the Israelis that stemmed on that occasion from the Madrid peace talks. When the Oslo Accords were announced, he wrote the first and I think most devastating legal critique of the Oslo Agreement's manifold flaws. This work was a kind of crucial, although I don't know how many of you know about it, but this was kind of a crucial legal analytic companion to my father's own multifaceted attacks on Oslo's flimsy edifice, which for some reason manages to be standing up today, but I think we all know better. And all throughout his service as a human rights lawyer and a legal advisor, Reza has amazingly kept up his own legal practice via his family's law firm where I interned many, many years ago. There he remains much sought after as Palestine's authority on matters such as business law, corporations law, contracts, etc., over and above his specialty as a human rights lawyer. More recently, we've been happily introduced to his writing over the past, I think, decade and a half, where he's allowed the world a glimpse of Palestine as it exists today, in all its complexities and contradictions. His prose, while never really shying away from both the harsh reality of life under occupation and, to be fair, the mistakes and foibles that an occupied people might make, this work has given us the fullness and universality of the Palestinian experience with a sharp and careful eye. What is clear from his writing is that his principled and, dare I said it, a steadfast stance that in essence distinctions between people based on impermissible factors like race and religion must not stand. This is true whether he's telling the tragic and compelling story of his father Aziz, one of Palestine's great legal figures in his own time, in his memoir Strangers in the House, or taking us along on his journeys through the actual terrain of Palestine in his work Palestinian Walks, with its amazing subtitle and quite evocative, Notes on a Vanishing Landscape. His documentation of life under military siege and more humdrum but no less pernicious occupation show us a people trying to resist and staying steadfast despite the overwhelming military and material force arrayed against them. Along the way, Reza's work has gained increasing and significant notoriety, garnering awards such as the Orwell Prize for Political Writing, and he's also seen his work adapted for the stage. At times, his observations are painful, and they seem to offer little hope to the sympathetic reader, but they must be seen in context. He is one of the few who do not condescend to tell us what we should be thinking about the Middle East. What should we think about the Middle East? He doesn't try to tell us. He observes. And in that context, he understands that for all the differences and divisions within the Palestinian people, the land is there for all and offers its majesties to those who would love and respect it. My father used to remind us, I'm sure many of you remember this, of Gramsci's exhortation, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Reza Shehadeh, in his work and his writing, lives up to that maxim as best as anyone among us. After all, who else would argue the justice of the Palestinian cause with an armed Israeli settler that Reza came upon in the countryside, who had snuck out of the settlement to smoke a nargile loaded with opiated hashish in peace? And with that, it is my great pleasure to give you Reza Shehadeh.
My thanks to Professors Aqil Belgrami and Wadia Saeed for these wonderful introductions. It is a great honor to be giving the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. 10 years, can you hear me well? Yeah. 10 years after his death, I, like many of you, can still hear his voice as well as the voices of so many others who say, if only Edward Said were alive today, we need him more than ever. I have often wondered what he might have said about what is happening in Palestine today. His voice is irreplaceable. He was and continues to be an inspiring figure. Not only was he a brilliant scholar and uncompromisingly honest intellectual, but very important for me today, he had the almost unique courage, confidence, and integrity that enabled him to listen and grasp what remains beyond the comprehension of many Palestinians outside Palestine. My hope is to do justice to his memory by speaking as candidly about three matters that interested him greatly: culture, language, and politics. Let me start with language. On the stage of the Cultural Palace in Ramallah last June, Salim Daw, a short, thin, bespectacled Palestinian actor from Haifa, sits on a suitcase, his head shaved, bald, his expression intense and sorrowful. He begins his one-man autobiographical play, Sag Salim, by pleading with the audience to understand him. He announces that after much thought, he has decided to leave the country. But before leaving, he wants to talk. I have so much to say, years of words, he announces. But he warns that when he starts talking, he begins to tremble. This is not a play, he says. You have come to see someone who doesn't know what to do with himself. Let me first begin by telling you where I come from. I was born and grew up in the Galilean village of El Bani. And so, with satire and self-deprecating humor, he recounts his life from the time he was born a few years after the Nakba to this day. He muses on how, as a child, he could not understand why his neighbors in the village were talked of as mutasallilin, infiltrators. As he speaks the word, his face assumes an expression of perplexity, sadness, resilience, and fatigued endurance. He's almost in tears as he asks, these were neighbors. Their homes are in the village. How did they become outlaws who could only be mentioned in whispers? The terribly forlorn yet obdurate expression on Salim's face as he hesitantly, almost guiltily, utters the word infiltrators is one that I immediately recognized as quintessentially Palestinian. It has continued to haunt me since that performance. I was still thinking of it as I drove a few days later down to the Jordan Valley through the lunar hills between Jerusalem and Jericho. There were many road signs to recently built settlements served by roads that we Palestinians could not use. How odd, having separate roads for different groups as well as different categories of land to which different rules apply. And yet, as I drive along, fully aware of where I can go and where I'm forbidden from going, readily taking the circuitous routes that confound the geography of the place. It was Salim Daw's play that alerted me to what I was taking for granted. As I drove, I wondered how many more terms I have unwittingly adopted and the extent to which I have made the language of occupation and defeat my own. Let me take this opportunity today to explore together, in the first part of this lecture, how some of these terms have become so deeply ingrained in our consciousness that we stopped thinking about them. In the second part, we will look at what I call the legal narrative of the two protagonists, Israeli and Palestinian, and how and why that of the Israeli dominated. And in the last part, I will conclude by describing what it would take for a vocabulary of peace to develop. Only a few of the Palestinians forced out of their homes by Israel in 1948 were bold enough to try to infiltrate back to their homes, to the homes they left. Most decided to wait outside until the hostilities ended. They were given tents and provisions to help them survive. And here is our first twist of terminology. The Palestinians who were forced out of their homes and country were not defined by the UN as refugees with the full rights accorded to this category the world over. To have considered them as refugees would have implied that Palestine was their country, to which they should be allowed to return. On both counts, that was not how the Israeli authorities saw it. They did their best to make sure the return would never happen. Rather than be placed under the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, and be subject to the legal regime of international refugees established in 1951, they were accorded a special status, and a specialized unit was created by the UN to take care of them. This was UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency. In so doing, only the needs of these refugees were recognized, but not their rights. The significance of this distinction remains of great importance to this day. In reporting on the survey published on 19 June 2013 by the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the Guardian newspaper failed to mention that the largest number of refugees today by country of origin are the Palestinians. When a reader challenged this, the paper published this correction, quote, "A reader has pointed out that 4.9 million Palestinian refugees don't appear in the statistics in our stories. This is because they are not registered with UNHCR, but with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East," unquote. In Israel, the property of these refugees was defined as absentee property and placed in the hands of a custodian, never to be returned or compensated for, as the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan have confirmed. And so began our long ordeal of confinement by exclusivist categorization. Palestinian refugees became a specialized category, apart from refugees the world over, and absentees a category without context, and thus denied compensation and return. Meanwhile, Arab Jews who were being absorbed into the new country of Israel were not being called refugees. They came through ma'abarot, Hebrew for transits, as though by coming to Israel they were entering the gates of heaven and ascending to the heights. In Hebrew, they were said to make aliyah. They were not mere immigrants to the new country. Instead, they were returning after 2,000 years of longing. A few weeks ago, the Israeli High Court rejected the appeal of 21 appellants who wanted their nationality to be listed as Israeli rather than Jewish in the population registry. Palestinians, who are often accused of denying the existence of Israel, find a strange ally with the High Court. Then there were also the internal absentees as well as the internal infiltrators. These were Palestinians who never left Palestine. They only temporarily moved away from their village to stay in another part of Palestine that became Israel. But when they tried to return to their villages, they were prevented from doing so. This prohibition continues to this day. Amongst these was the poet Taha Muhammad Ali from the village of Safuriye. He did not leave Palestine, yet still could not return to his village and ended up living in nearby Nazareth. In spring and summer, he and his fellow villagers would steal into their land surreptitiously, pick wild herbs, prompting him to write, "This land denies, cheats, and betrays us. We're too much for it. It grumbles about us, detests us. The newcomers, sailors, and usurpers uproot the backyard gardens, burying the trees. They keep us from looking too long at the anemone blossom and cyclamen, and won't allow us to touch the herbs and wild artichoke and chicory." So already by 1948, we have three groups of Palestinians: those who are now Israeli citizens, those in Jordan who are Jordanian citizens, and those who are stateless UNRWA-registered refugees in Arab countries or scattered elsewhere in the world. More fragmentation and differentiation was yet to come, ultimately making a mosaic of the Palestinian people. Sometimes we, the Palestinians of 48, and those like me of 67, come together. When in the eyes of Israeli Foreign Minister Naftali Bennett speaking about us in the world of Greater Israel, we are likened to shrapnel in Israel's butt. Returning to Salim Dow and his fellow villagers, they knew that if you have become a citizen of the new state, you had to celebrate its Independence Day. Otherwise, you will be viewed with suspicion. Like all other Palestinians in Israel, they were taught in school that Israeli Jews fought and won their independence from the British, thus denying both the presence and resistance of Palestinian Arabs, and falsifying history by failing to acknowledge the British contribution to the creation of Israel and snugly placing Israel among nations who overcame imperialism and secured their independence from the colonizer. How odd it must have felt for those who had just lost everything to have to swallow their pride and celebrate the Independence Day of the country that had caused their Nakba. But Salim Dow has a different take. In his satirical manner, he informs us that the only day we felt free was on Israel's Independence Day. The women prepared a picnic. We all got on trucks. No traffic tickets would be issued on that day. All the way to Lake Tiberias, we sang and had fun. And the best part was when we got near a police car. We cheered with great glee. Close to the water, we laid rugs on the ground, had a barbecue, sang and danced. Every year, a few died swimming. Why not? We Arabs drown in their independence. Then in the evening, we would feel sad having to return home. Here, our freedom ends. Salim raises his voice and declares, so that the freedom of others could begin, which is democracy. While Salim and the other estimated 160,000 Palestinians who managed to stay in what became Israel had to endure their strange new fate, I and the generation of Palestinians born after 1948 in the West Bank lived under Jordanian rule in almost total ignorance of what was happening in nearby Israel. My father refused to register us with UNRWA. Reluctantly, we became citizens of Jordan, which was trying its best to make us forget we were Palestinians. But that hope of dividing Palestine between Israel and Jordan, with each absorbing as citizens those refugees who were not refugees, was foiled by Israel when in 1967 it banged on our doors and took over the West Bank from Jordan. It was hubris, the bane of all powerful leaders. Until 1967, we lived with a simple tale. From my family, I heard about the heavenly Jaffa. They were forced to leave. From the school curriculum, we learned the geography of historic Palestine that took no account of Israel's presence. My geography teacher, Abu al-Awad, who wore the umbaz, traditional Arab dress, would draw the map of Palestine on the blackboard. There would be the Dead Sea in the south, further north, Lake Tiberias, and above it, another small lake, Hule. We had to memorize all this, unaware that Hule was no longer there, having been drained in the early 50s, and incidentally, not because of the malaria-bearing mosquitoes. We also sang, as we still do to this day, of Laban al-Jamousi, the milk of the water buffalo, that once lived in Hule and has now become extinct, just like Hule itself and the way of life of the marsh Arabs who had been living there. Today, Israel has created a mini Hule as a national park with a few imported water buffaloes forlornly scattered in its mini marsh. Soon afterwards, we began our education about Israeli ways. We could have had a head start had we been willing to listen to our fellow Palestinians who had been through it all earlier. None of the tactics Israel used to control us were new. The military government that ruled over the Palestinians who were granted Israeli citizens in 1948 had been dissolved only 6 months before the next one began in the occupied territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Israel used the old tactics and even the same personnel who were in charge in the first round. I remember one relative from Haifa who had stayed in Palestine and became an Israeli citizen, telling my father how it was going to be and what we should expect. He began by assuring us that now you are in the honeymoon period. But he said it will only be a short honeymoon. Afterwards, the hardships will begin. First, they will impose heavy taxes. Then, land acquisition would start. Then, what is left of the land would be rendered out of reach through land use planning. As we later found out, this was exactly how it happened. But we were not prepared to listen and take precautions, for we considered those who stayed the lackeys of the enemy and the defeated who were lorded over by their Israeli masters. No, neither they nor we were glamorous. All the glamour went to those who held the gun and fought like men, not to those who practiced sumud, who endured and persevered. I remember a cartoon which one acquaintance had pinned to his door, showing someone being kicked in the butt. Underneath, he had written the word sumud. That we in turn will not be listened to, I learned later when I joined in 1991 negotiations in Washington between Israel and the PLO. But more of this later. After the 67 war, Israel spread the word that its occupation of Palestinian lands was the most benevolent in history. Still, the ungrateful Palestinians did not take it lying down. Those who resisted the occupation were called fidaiyin. Israel's word for them was mukharribin. I've always wondered about this word. It's what you call a naughty child in Arabic, anta mukharrib. You are a spoiler. But what I wondered, were we spoiling? Then I realized that Israel was putting things in order for us and for them, and we were spoiling it all. This was it. It took some time before we were upgraded. Eventually, when US President George Bush declared the war on terror, we graduated into being called irhabiyin, terrorists. Each and every one of us, without exception. In Israel's eyes, we are all potential terrorists. In fact, we Palestinians are all there by permission from the Israeli state. Those who carry a Palestinian passport are no different. The number on that passport remains the one assigned us by Israel and recorded in their security files and databases. Israel can, at its whim, prohibit anyone from returning home by revoking their residency. This is the state of all Palestinians now living in the Palestinian territories and East Jerusalem. We are all infiltrators, living where we are not supposed to live. But it is much worse for Ihab Ahmed Sawalha, a young man from Asir al-Shamaliye, a village north of Nablus. When he was born, the official at the Rafidia hospital in Nablus made a clerical error, registering his name as Irhab, terrorism. And so it remained on the Palestinian Authority identity card that was issued to him when he turned 16. With such a name, Ihab's life was hell. When Israeli soldiers see his name at checkpoints, they refuse to allow him to pass. He had to leave school because he was being mocked by his classmates. And now that he is of working age, he cannot get permits to work in Israel. You might think Ihab's problem could be easily solved by requesting a correction of his name on the identity card issued by the Palestinian Authority. But even though the Palestinian Authority issues these cards, authorization has to come from Israel for the initial issuing and for every change made to them subsequently. So far, Israeli authorities have refused to correct Ihab's name, so he has to endure life in the occupied territories being called terrorism. All these designations, categorizations, and prohibitions are intended primarily to keep us on edge, to make us guilty for merely living on our land. The numerous checkpoints that make our lives so difficult and which fragment our territory serve no security purpose, as events this summer illustrate. 2 days into Eid al-Fitr, last July, Israel decided to open the barriers at crossing points leading from the West Bank to East Jerusalem and the rest of Israel. Immediately, there were huge crowds making the most of this and going to Jerusalem, Jaffa, and the Galilee. Some were seeing the sea for the first time. As has happened before, one man, this time from Nablus, drowned in the sea off the shore of Jaffa. There was no need for permits, no stamping of documents, or any checks, making it possible for those with a security record to go through. So much for the security argument that Israel claims make these checkpoints necessary. In their kindness, the Israeli authorities allowed Palestinians for 2 days during their feast to enjoy the land of which they dream before the gates were shut again. As I traveled through the Jordan Valley that day, I was thinking that I'm no novice when it comes to looking at the land in an attempt to decipher Israeli designations, what is public, what are closed areas, and what are firing zones. I could see signs placed by the Israeli army right where the Bedouins pitch their tents and put their goats to pasture. That said, danger, stay away, firing zone. The area I was driving past was part of the over 2 million acres of land the Israeli army already uses as training or firing zones. For over 3 decades now, I have been writing about the human rights aspects of the occupation and the illegality of Jewish settlements. In my 1982 book, The Third Way, I described a strange visit I had at my law office in Ramallah from settlers from Afra, a settlement situated north of Ramallah, established almost exclusively on privately owned Palestinian lands. The settlers asked me to register a company for them. When I refused, Aharon said, "Why not? We live in Afra, you live in Ramallah. We have expertise we can offer you just as you have expertise to offer us. Why should any of the locals refuse to do business with us? We are bringing progress to the area. We are not depriving you of anything. The more settlements, the more progress. How can that be bad for you? Aharon did not want to understand, and he has been at it since then. By 1987, the number of Mukharribin became plentiful in the occupied territories. We practically all became spoilers. We used every non-violent means, boycotts, civil resistance, and a few violent ones, to indicate that we've had enough of occupation and will not stop our civil resistance until it ends. The first intifada had begun. The military struggle, as it was, had brought no results. It was the non-violent first intifada that was waged inside the occupied territories that brought Israel to the negotiation table. In 1991, 5 years after it began, Israel was persuaded to attend the International Peace Conference in Madrid, which was followed by the negotiations in Washington between Israel and the Palestinian delegation. But the leadership outside failed to recognize the important role of the struggle which those of us living under Israeli rule had played, as I was to discover when I took part in the negotiation as legal advisor. I remember Edward Said coming especially to Washington to offer his services to the delegation, only to be refused. With the extensive media interest at the time, he could have played a crucial role in explaining to the American public what was taking place at these negotiations. What sort of leadership refuses an offer from a giant like Said? Throughout my one-year experience with the negotiations in Washington in 1991-92, and for some time afterwards, one question kept nagging me. How did Israel succeed in using more or less the same tactics against Palestinians and their property in 1967 that they had used in 1948? Why did Palestinians not learn how to foil these tactics? It was clear to me that Israel's strategy in the negotiations was to try its best to retain the almost 1,000 Israeli military orders that amended the local law and added to it, which dealt with every aspect of life in the occupied territories and organized the life and relations between the Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews living in the occupied territories. Different orders applied to the two groups living on the same land that discriminated between them in terms of allocation of land, use of natural resources, and possibilities for development and growth. Using the vehicle of military orders, Israeli laws were imported and made to apply exclusively to the settlers. Had the settlements been made to submit to the same restrictive and oppressive military orders to which Israel was subjecting the Palestinians, it would not have been possible for them to survive, prosper, and expand. There had to be apartheid, separate and unequal development, if Jewish settlements were to flourish. After a year of desperately trying to impress on the leadership the need for a legal strategy based on a review of these orders, instructions arrived from Tunis on 13 September 1992 that a review of the military orders would be harmful, since this can only give these orders recognition and legitimacy. When I heard this, I packed my bags and left. After I left Washington, I remained intrigued by the difference in attitude to law between the two sides. I began exploring what I called the legal narrative of both. As I understand it, a legal narrative is how a people tell the story of the right to a land using the symbolic language of law. A legal narrative is by necessity a constructed narrative. For it to stand, it must have consistency and its own internal logic. It must have external reference points to which others can relate, and it must be communicable. In the occupied territories, Israel had mainly expressed its narrative in military orders which it wanted to keep intact. As for the Palestinian leadership, their thinking on legal matters is characterized by a search for absolutes, as evident in the excessive importance they gave during the negotiations to the recognition of the PLO, believing that if Israel recognized the organization, they would also be recognizing its program of self-determination. It is also characterized by being abstract. It fails to consider the changing legal reality and shifting grounds over which it is conducting negotiations, and fails to anticipate the legal case of the other side, making it unable to respond to it adequately. Elements of the narrative of the new period in the PLO struggle, characterized by agreeing to negotiations with Israel, can be traced to the meeting of the Palestinian National Council in Algiers in 15 November 1988, when the PLO recognized the need for an international conference whose aims would include, quote, the annulment of all measures of annexation and appropriation and the removal of settlements, unquote. But alas, they failed to devise a strategy for achieving this key goal. Instead, the 1993 Declaration of Principles and the 1995 Interim Agreement, which together make up the Oslo Accords, reached between Israel and the PLO, provided that the military orders were to remain in force. Though it remained undeclared, what was in fact being preserved was the system of apartheid. The different approaches to the two sides to law cannot alone explain the dismal failure of the PLO in conducting negotiations with Israel. It was also because the leadership outside the occupied territories did not recognize or understand the nature of the struggle of those of us living under Israeli rule, just as we had failed to understand the struggle of Salim Dow and those who stayed in Israel after 1948. It seemed that the entire experience and struggle of the Palestinian people under occupation meant little to Palestinians living elsewhere, and thus no lessons were learned. The dominance of one kind of struggle, that of the glamorous fidaiyin of the camps, prevailed at the expense of all others. And this was certainly not because of a dearth of reporting from Palestinian organizations in the occupied territories. I wonder where the reports of El-Haq, the Palestinian affiliate of the International Commission of Jurists, for example, ever accorded serious consideration by the leadership outside the occupied territories? Did they take note of our study of Road Plan 50 of 1984? This was a comprehensive reorganization of roads in the West Bank aiming to link Israeli settlements already built or planned to each other and to Israel, bypassing Palestinian towns and villages. In the West Bank, we succeeded in forming a national committee to challenge the plan as a whole and its various sectors by submitting hundreds of objections. We also suggested that the plan be challenged at the international level and the opinion of the International Court of Justice at The Hague be sought. We made sure that the study reached the PLO, but never got any response. Perhaps I was naive to expect the resistance to the road plan would stand any chance against the much more glamorous armed resistance, armed struggle. When the leadership refused to listen to those of us in the occupied territories, I could hear the hollow echo of what we in the West Bank had said of the 1948 Arabs and our refusal to listen to them. It was at this time that I began noticing how the Israeli settlers were taking care to plant trees, plan their settlements, and landscape their surroundings, not at all as though these were temporary establishments. The effect is evident today. The Israelis have organized their presence on our land for their own use and enjoyment in the best possible manner. They also encouraged their students to hike in the land and get to know it. None of this was encouraged by our leaders. Now, Israeli children know our land better than most Palestinians know it. When PLO leaders first returned after the Oslo Accords were signed, many of them were shocked by the presence and nature of the Jewish settlements, their surprise betraying their failure to comprehend. This had terrible consequences. For example, the occupied West Bank included a good part of the Dead Sea, which has extremely important benefits for tourism and mineral extraction. But the Oslo deal that was reached severed the connection between this important body of water and the Palestinians, who have had no access to it for the past 20 years. It might be said that 20 years after they were signed, the Oslo Accords are now part of history. The harm they did to the cause of peace has become well known, and the difference between the two sides in their approach to law and politics that led to the disastrous deal in Oslo persists in the case of Jerusalem. Throughout the Accords, Israel was careful to keep Jerusalem out of the negotiations. As a result, the Palestinian Authority has never exercised any authority over that city. After the 1967 war, Israel annexed Jerusalem and environs without once using the word annexation. To oppose this annexation, the Palestinian and Jordanian leaderships ordered the Palestinian residents of the city to boycott municipal elections. There is no doubt that Israel's unilateral annexation by another name was illegal under international law, and that by voting in the municipal elections, the Palestinian sector of the city could be seen as legitimizing this illegal action. Almost half a century later, the boycott has never been re-evaluated, and the Jerusalem Palestinians have been left hostage to full Israeli rule, even when they constitute 38% of the total population of Jerusalem. By not allowing them to vote, Israel was given the greatest gift, free of charge. They were left paying taxes to the Israeli municipality while having no voice and no representation. Not surprisingly, the discrimination against them is immense, whether in infrastructure, education, municipal services, or economic prospects. The PLO had no vision in encountering Israeli actions over Jerusalem by empowering the substantial Palestinian presence in the city. Blinded by fear of losing the reins of power, it was and continues to be willing to sacrifice the welfare of some 275,800 Palestinians. After 44 years of Israeli rule, Jerusalem has become a city organized, run, and designed for the sole benefit and prosperity of its Israeli residents, with a small place, a ghetto of sorts, left for the disenfranchised Palestinian residents. The case of Jerusalem as a demonstration of the inability of Palestinians to devise practical solutions through legal mechanism stands in stark opposition to Israeli tactics. Israel never declared that it was annexing the West Bank, and yet to all intents and purposes it has done exactly that. Contrast this with the Palestinian struggle to win nominal recognition at the UN for the state of Palestine, when the Palestinian Authority has no sovereignty over any part of Palestine and no control over the borders. This illustrates the two ways of struggle: Israel's from below by administrative actions and means, and the PLO's by abstract formulae that have a strong ring but almost empty of meaning. Sometimes the Palestinian struggle to entrench the nominal virtual acquisition of a state continues in physical terms, such as the current construction in Ramallah of $1 million presidential palace for visiting heads of state who come to pay homage to the putative head of state yet to be born. After the Oslo deal was signed, I spent time writing about the different approaches to law of the two people. In 1997, I published From Occupation to Interim Accords, viewing and analyzing the Oslo Accords in a legal context. Edward Said contributed the foreword. In a review of the book published in Al Hayat newspaper, he described what I was doing as a post-mortem. The die was cast. It was too late. My experience of working with the leadership had taught me that there was no role for a legal advisor or indeed legal strategies in the way that Palestinian politics was conducted. The role of the intellectual had changed, as had that of the human rights activist. Now that the Oslo Accord had restructured the occupation, it was no longer possible to sustain the belief that occupation can be brought to an end by documenting the violations of the occupier and exposing their effect on the protected population suffering under a brutal occupation. Legal remedies for resisting the occupation also became subject to political negotiations between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The PA's heavy dependence on Israel has meant that Israeli pressure can succeed in deterring the PA, for example, from joining the International Criminal Court and holding Israeli officials liable for the crimes they committed against the Palestinian people. Instead of liberation, we have ended with a quasi-state where all powers were concentrated in one man, the very same man who negotiated and signed the Oslo Accords. And yet, even after accepting the defeat and documenting how it came about, there was no respite. Rather, an unsettling continuity in the experience of those who have been following the Israeli settlements methods. Perhaps there can never be any respite under occupation. Last summer, I saw the name of an Israeli lawyer I had encountered professionally years ago in a report of a land case. In the cases I had defended, he pleaded before the military land court that any land with a certain weed called netish growing on it was public land. From the recent report, I realized that he was still employing the same legal tactics to confiscate Palestinian land and still getting the same level of assistance from the Israeli civil administration that he was getting before the Oslo Accords. The similarities with those earlier cases I was involved in was staggering. They included the use of fake documents in the name of a settler-created company called no other than Watan, the nation, to registered land near the illegal settlement of Afra, bypassing a law that only a local company can buy land in the territory. The Palestinian owner of the land in question had built in 1988 on the land a two-story house. In 2003, this family came home one evening to discover that the locks of their house had been changed and that a Torah institute specializing in religion and finance had moved in. Both their house and the land around it were taken and a new fence put up with guard dogs to prevent them from even approaching it. It took 10 years for the district court in Jerusalem to decide that the land sale was forged, and it still is uncertain whether they will get their property back. The case had all the elements from the distant past: civil administration helping the settlers, a collaborator recruited to carry out illegal practices, and the courts, both military and civilian in Israel, showing bias and failing to assist the Arab claimant. Only this time, all of this was taking place under the nose of the Palestinian Authority that has dismally failed in protecting the Palestinian family against the illegal practices of the Jewish settlers. I was reminded of the words of Aharon, the settler from Afra. Why? We are not depriving you of anything. The more settlements, the more progress. How can that be bad for you? Driving down to the Jordan Valley, one can see the annexation wall Israel is building, most of which is built inside the Palestinian territory. The sight of the wall around expanded Jerusalem brought to mind the documentary film Infiltrators, directed by the Palestinian artist Khalid Jarrar. This film is about another kind of infiltrators, Palestinians infiltrating into their own territory, climbing over an 8-meter-high wall to cross from one part of the West Bank into another to get to work, to pray, or visit relatives. It was painful to see. The Qasabeh theater in Ramallah, where it was playing, was full. Many of the viewers were middle-class people who, for one reason or another, either they had money to spend in Israel or they were doing business with Israelis, could get permits to travel to Jerusalem without the hassle and danger of having to infiltrate. And there we all sat watching without shedding a tear for our destitute fellow Palestinians, mainly working-class people seeking jobs who had to go through the hazards and humiliation of climbing over that detestable wall. Was it voyeurism? What sort of people have we become to sit so passively viewing a film about our people's suffering that was devoid of redemption or relief? What has become of us? We sublimate our suffering into art. While culture flourishes, we show every sign of having given up on politics. Is this healthy? Pondering these questions, I continued my drive along the serpentine wall that curved and meandered, swerving around Israeli settlements. As I drove through this altered landscape, my mind turned to the past, to the end of the 1980s and the solidarity of the First Intifada, when if one sector, say, of the taxi drivers were punished or deprived of their rights, others would stand by them. With Oslo, much of that solidarity and the dream of an equitable society on which we hoped to build our state has vanished and is hardly remembered. The discrimination created by the Oslo Accords between the privileged and non-privileged was legislated in the interim agreement of 1995 between Israel and the PLO, where incredibly an entire section was devoted to describing different categories of VIPs and the privileges each would enjoy, all of them to be granted or withheld by Israel, depending on how our esteemed leaders behaved. A photographer friend of mine, Bassam al-Mohor, has a project for a photo book. He walked up and down Ramallah's main street, his camera against his thigh, taking photographs of the people passing by. He then did the same in Jaffa Road in West Jerusalem, a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. When he looked at both sets of photographs, he was struck by how similar the two people are. You could hardly tell Arab from Jew, he told me. Not only are the faces similar, so are the languages of the two sides, Arabic and Hebrew. And yet, according to the Israeli columnist Yossi Klein, quote, being raised on a certain image of the Arab did something to us. Today, it is hard to find Arabic speakers in Israel who are not Arabs or who were not born in a Muslim country. 90% of the Arabs in Israel speak Hebrew, while only 3% of Israeli-born Jews speak Arabic. In 2012, only some 2,000 Jewish high school students took the matriculation exam in the language of 20% of their country's residents. The teenagers who took their test in Arabic did not see it as a bridge. They saw it as a weapon, and most of them, presumably, were inducted into Unit 8200, an Israeli intelligence unit, unquote. The fact that Salim Daw, a Palestinian actor from Haifa, could perform his play successfully in Ramallah means that Palestinians from the 1948 area are finally able to tell their story to a sympathetic and understanding audience in the Palestinian areas occupied in 1967. This empathy has been fostered by the commonality of our experience as the Nakba of 1948 continues in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This is why, in order to have peace, we need to go back to what happened in 1948 and come to terms with that history. For it all started then. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians can start from 1967. Those who endured occupation and those who experienced life under full Israeli rule understand Israel and the Israeli ways better than those without that experience, and so can point the way to a vision of a future of living together. From Jericho in the Jordan Valley, I continued to Nazareth to visit Taha Muhammad Ali's village, Safariye. So small is Israel-Palestine. Along the way, I saw how the land is too interconnected to ever be divisible. Just by looking at the present reality and traveling around the country, it was easy to come to the conviction that there is no way that the physical interconnection can be severed or undone. There are too many roads, too many places of residence for both sides that are in close proximity to each other, too many old towns and cities adjacent to new ones, which are now divided by walls and sometimes merely by a fence that cannot possibly endure. For anyone visiting this country, it becomes quickly obvious that the preservation of the present mosaic of geographic fragmentation with sour and spiteful people living side by side is simply not viable in the long term. It is only sustainable by the exercise of force, which cannot last long. Walls would have to come down along with the barriers of prejudice, anger, and hatred. And yet, in Palestine, Israel, a new language for peace has not been developed, nor is there an attempt at creating a common culture between the two sides. The negotiations that began on 14 August 2013 between Israeli and Palestinian representatives under American patronage were not attended by much enthusiasm on either side. Israel agreed to participate because it needs to pretend it is working for peace. The talks are taking place behind closed doors between two hugely unequal sides. There is no indication that these discussions will be based on international law. One of the parties, Israel, controls most aspects of Palestinian life, as well as the very existence of the Palestinian Authority. Had there been a powerful third party invoking the Fourth Geneva Convention and taking seriously the enforcement mechanisms provided in that law, then Israel as an occupier would simply have to withdraw and reverse the consequences of its illegal occupation. But the third party observing these talks is terribly biased to one side. A month after these talks began, there was still no agreement on the agenda. Polling shows that most Israelis oppose withdrawing to pre-1967 ceasefire lines, even if land swaps were agreed to accommodate Jewish settlements. This has led a number of observers on both sides to accurately note that the most any Israeli leader is prepared to offer is less than the minimum that any Palestinian leader could ever accept. The proliferation of cultural output by the Palestinians, whether in Israel or in the occupied territories, and the strong response and support Palestinian performers and artists have received in various parts of Western Europe for their work, sends a clear signal of support for the Palestinian cause from civil society in these countries. Perhaps the latest EU decision to deny settlement products the privileges granted other Israeli exports is an indication that sometimes governments have to respond to the will of their people. These timid attempts by the EU to enforce international law will in time gain momentum, and Israel might eventually be forced to submit to international law. It should be remembered that the boycott movement in support of ending apartheid in South Africa took many years to yield results. While the most recent so-called peace talks are proceeding, Israel continues to prejudice their outcome by enlarging the settlements in the West Bank. While both international and local law clearly indicate what is to be done with these implants, why then does this not happen? The simple answer is because Israel is winning, and because its people have not yet begun to pay the price for their government's policies of not seeking peace, nor have they been able to grasp that there is benefit in changing from a warlike to a peaceful stance. As long as Israel is winning, it can continue to put off attempts by the international community to enforce these laws. The veteran Israeli journalist Gideon Levy confirms this in an article he wrote for Haaretz last July. He quote, "The change won't come from within. That has been clear for a long time. As long as Israelis don't pay a price for the occupation, or at least don't make the connection between cause and effect, they have no incentive to bring it to an end," unquote. But there are those in Israeli society who are worried by how the continuation of the occupation is affecting their society. Another Israeli columnist, originally from South Africa, Roy Isaacovich, wrote also last July that, quote, "Israel doesn't have to precisely replicate South Africa to conform to the international definition of an apartheid regime. The real apartheid in South Africa was the apartheid of the heart and the mind, the apartheid mentality. True apartheid is the elevation of one group above another on the basis of race, religion, tribe, or nationality, and the consequent arrogation of rights and freedoms that are denied the other. I see this mentality everywhere," he wrote, "in our apathy to what is happening in the territories, the ease with which we absolve ourselves of responsibility, and our almost total lack of empathy for the other, if he or she is not Jewish. The discriminatory legislation is not where apartheid begins. It begins in the hearts and minds of people." What then can be done? I would argue that we need a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, making Israel realize that the hiatus in the application of international law will not last forever, and that it will begin to exact an economic price. On the other, encouraging it to see the benefits it can derive from making peace. Until these two realizations come about, the Israelis, who show no signs of recovering from the euphoria of victory in the detrimental war of 1967, will continue to believe what Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, declared at the time, that Israel is now an empire. Why should this empire, now the sixth biggest exporter of weapons in the world, submit to international law? They will continue on their triumphant path until, as the German expression puts it, they triumph themselves to defeat. As for Palestinians, I'm afraid that we have regressed as a nation and failed in devising a shared, sustainable self-definition. Now there is a resurgence of fragmented identities, whether based on faction, religion, clan, or class. The national definition has suffered an enormous blow. The PLO, for all its faults, was forging some common strands and providing a sense of purpose under a national banner. Now it is but a shadow of its former self. We are united by our enmity to Israel and our common history of the Nakba, but not by social cohesion, public spiritedness, or values expressed in legislative instruments that define a way of life for our society. When I and others started Al-Haq in 1979, our aim was two-pronged: to fight Israeli violations and to help our society develop along the principle of the rule of law. We were successful in making progress on the first front, but made few gains on the second. Those who fought the attempts to reform the legal system were not only the Israeli authorities, but also the external Palestinian leadership, whose primary concern was that its supporters, mainly those of Fatah, are in control of the important positions regardless of their performance or dedication to the development of their society. This is as true now as it was then. A good example is the failure to agree on a student fund to help all Palestinian students with their university expenses. Mustafa Barghouti, the head of the Mubadara movement, has been working on this for many years, but he continues to meet with resistance from those who prefer to keep the old patronage system. Consequently, our society remains underdeveloped, failing to move in a direction that serves ideals people fought to develop, with no real progress made towards the society we had long dreamed of creating, one that is caring and well organized, whether with regard to labor or the rights to health, education, and social services. To our shame, our Palestinian security forces still use torture to interrogate suspects, sometimes leading to the death of those under detention. The two main concerns of the Palestinian Authority seem to be how to please funders so as not to stop the flow of money from the donor countries, and how to encourage investments. And yet, after 20 years of self-rule and the receipt of $23 billion from the donor community, making the occupied territories one of the highest per capita recipients of non-military aid in the world, we still find 27,000 of our laborers having to endure the disgrace of building illegal Jewish settlements and working in their industrial zones. It is not Israel alone that needs peace to stop the rot that is destroying their society. We need it no less. My late father, Aziz Shehadeh, was one of the first Palestinian leaders to propose a Palestinian state alongside Israel. He truly believed that not only peace was possible, but that it would transform our region into one of the best in the world, and that the cooperation of Palestinian Arabs with Israeli Jews would bring great benefits to both people and to the region as a whole. I have continued to uphold his views and to believe that together we, Palestinians and Israelis, will find a way to live and prosper and define ourselves, not in opposition to each other, but as complementary communities enhancing each other, just like the orchestra that joins musicians from both sides, which Edward Said helped create. For the time being, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, seems to be a necessary tactic, but it is a means, not an end. The end that we should be seeking is one of sharing, not one where anger and hatred fuel exclusion, partition, and separation. After the boycott does its work and Israel, as the aggressor, comes to its senses and begins to apply the law, then the question of the political outcome, whether one state, two states, or a confederation with the other states in the region, must be left for a referendum. Once people's rights are recognized, their imagination will be released and the future will begin to take shape according to what would bring the greatest benefit and happiness to all parties involved. When considering this matter, one should not underestimate the human factor. We who have suffered the difficult past cannot and will not be allowed to prejudice the future of the new generations. The young on both sides, Israeli and Palestinian, will rightly insist that the future is theirs. They don't want their future to be determined by the dismal past that the older generations have endured. In 1993, I realized how quickly can change happen when I heard what young Palestinians were saying. Just before the Oslo deal was signed, they swore that they would fight Israel to the last day of their lives. But once the deal was signed and began to offer a small glimmer of hope, they were willing to change. You heard them say, "Yikhrib Beit al-Hjar," damn stones. When reminded of their earlier position, they responded, "But we want to have a better future. We want to try to live in peace with the Israelis." Prominent amongst those who went through a complete transformation and put their faith entirely in the peace process was the Fatah leader, Marwan Marghouti, who is now serving several life sentences in an Israeli jail. Nor is it possible to hold the coming generation to the values we held or which we espoused during what we now regard as the golden time of struggle, the First Intifada. To them, we are the generation that failed. They will welcome the opportunity to try something different, and they have every right to do so. Edward Said said that the musical workshops and the West Eastern Divan Orchestra that joined musicians from both sides were among the most important things he accomplished in his life. He considered the orchestra as a powerful illustration of his ideas on humanism, the crossing of borders, equality, and the value of both a humanistic and a musical education. Edward had no illusion that the orchestra was a way of making peace, but he also knew that one day the conflict will end and there would be a need for a new vocabulary of peace. He saw the project as an experiment in learning to harness our human resources and talents in the production of something that neither side can achieve on its own. What better than an orchestra to pave the way to a harmonious future? Given that the 20-year-old peace process has only brought inequality, injustice, and violence, we need to redeem the degraded word peace. In this, Edward can serve as an inspiration. We have to start with imagining a better world before it can begin to materialize. What a beautiful image Edward Said has left us with, a future celebrated with music, produced with passion, enthusiasm, and skill by musicians from both sides of the divide. Perhaps on this 10th anniversary of his death, we should all work harder to realize his vision and make a just and equal peace a reality. I have no doubt that eventually we'll get there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I can answer questions.
So if anybody has questions, feel free to either stay where you are or approach the microphone to ask them.
Thank you very much for your lecture. What I wanted to know, that like what you said was that apartheid comes from within the hearts and the minds of people. So I want to know what you thought of the current Palestinian education system in terms of teaching about peace. And as you know, there was a recent Palestinian Authority map that was released which featured all of Palestine, including Israel, wrapped in the Palestinian flag. And in terms of, as you said, the ends that we should be pursuing is one of sharing, and what your thoughts were on that. I was just wondering.
This issue of the Palestinian education system being racist and anti-Semitic often comes up from people who hear these lies, I must say, and don't investigate any further. The fact of the matter is that the Palestinian curriculum has been through so many processes of revision, and if you want a full discussion of this, there was a lengthy article and based on a study in the Journal of Palestine Studies. I'm not sure which one, but you can look it up. The truth of the matter is it's exactly the reverse. Israeli official maps from official departments always make Israel, in the entire Israel of 67 and the occupied territories. And the Israeli curriculum teaches its students to hate Palestinians and stereotype them. And if you want a very thorough study on this, there has been recently a new book by the daughter of Paled, General Paled, which, sorry? Nurit, yeah, Nurit al-Hana Paled, which studies the curriculum and shows the biases involved there. So it's one of those misconceptions, I'm afraid, and I would advise you to look more carefully into it rather than repeat it without thinking about it.
Feel free to come up.
Yeah. So do you think it's more likely there'll be a two-state solution before there'll be a one-state, or there could be a one-state solution?
Well, I think that the dream is one-state solution and one perhaps confederation of the entire area of the Eastern Mediterranean. But the reality is that a lot has been done, and most of the world now considers that there is an occupation and there needs to be an end for the occupation. And I think we have to go step by step. First, we need to end the occupation and then create a Palestinian state, even for one day or 24 hours. That state will then make an agreement with the Israeli state, and the two can make agreements with other states, and it goes on like that. But I don't believe that it is tactically or realistic to expect that we can go into the one-state solution, especially that to speak of one state makes the Israelis feel that this is denying their existence as an Israeli people. And I think we have to consider that, because peace can be made only by the two sides and not by one side dreaming on behalf of everybody.
How will it be possible, and how is it possible for the Palestinians to choose new leadership when they have been a traumatized society, an occupied society, and a society that's been intentionally broken up into different factions, like other countries, other weak countries that have been attacked by the United States? The leadership is often placed by the powerful entities like the United States. So I can't even imagine how the Palestinian people would then choose a different leadership than the United States would allow and control.
It's not exactly comparable to other places, and I think elections will happen, and perhaps they should happen amongst the Palestinian people, not only in the occupied territories but everywhere, and then there can be they can choose a different leadership. Elections did happen, and they chose the leadership that then was condemned, of course, and you're right that there was interference. But you know, the reality of politics in the world is that the big powers interfere, and it is necessary for people to struggle against that interference and to seek to find what is best for them. And I think the process, part of the confusion that is happening is the unwillingness to understand the damage that the Oslo Accords have done, and to find a new and different vision. I think the question of vision and imagination is lacking, and that perhaps can play a very big role if we all work harder on creating new visions and helping people imagine a new reality.
For an extremely illuminating talk. I learned a lot from it. I have a comment and a question. I was struck by two of your observations. One which concerned the fragmentation of Palestinian society. The sort of disintegration of whatever level of unity existed in multiple and even sometimes maybe contrasting identities. And the second observation that struck me was your comment on the boycott movement, that we must not confuse means with ends, that the boycott may be necessary at this particular moment. Now, the reason these two things struck me, because they struck a chord in my experience in South Africa. The great success of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was to, while building some kind of a unity, they never managed to build a full unity, but while building some kind of a unity to begin to isolate the apartheid power itself. The ANC's success in winning over individual whites into the ANC, and even greater, the success of the Black consciousness movement to sort of cut through the legal divisions imposed by apartheid law and create a completely different understanding of what is black. Black is not a color, black is an experience. If you're oppressed, you're black. Okay, that kind of... when I went to South Africa in 1993, I was shocked by the fact that South Africans, whether black or white, left or right, men or women, all of them shared a certain understanding of the rest of Africa. All of them had bought into the apartheid notion of the fact that the rest of Africa is what they didn't want to be. And I realized that we, as an anti-apartheid movement, I was based in Tanzania and Uganda, that we had actually contributed to this because we had failed to build links with anti-apartheid forces inside South Africa and in white South Africa in particular. So I would just like a comment from you on these observations. I know they don't exactly fit, they can't possibly, but I'd be interested in your response.
Well, I think much more can be done, and not enough at all is being done to make these links with the Israeli people. As South African blacks were able to do with the white community. Some efforts and I think greater development was possible before the Oslo Accords, and there was a leftist movement on both sides that joined hands and did so much more together. But I think by and large this has been almost reduced to naught at this point. And part of it is Israel's awareness that this is dangerous for the regime in Israel. And one manifestation of how it stops in the way of this are these very prominent red signs that are placed at all the barriers saying in Hebrew and English and Arabic, but mainly in Hebrew, to the Israelis that if you cross to the Palestinian territories, it says Area A under the Palestinian Authority, you'll be violating the law. So they are preventing by law the Israelis from entering and having anything to do with the Palestinians. Of course, the interesting point here is that by putting it in this way, the implication is that the Palestinian territories are only Area A, that Israelis can go anywhere else and settle, and they are still in Israel. Only if they go to Area A are they going into the Palestinian territories. So the Palestinian territories in the consciousness of the Israelis is becoming limited to the 3% or less than 3%, which is Area A. But as a result, only the very, very few Israelis enter and join in common actions with the Palestinians and so on. So I think I think in general, the experience of South Africa, whether in the past or how the apartheid regime has ended, has had minimal effect on our region, which is a sad thing and an unfortunate thing, because there's much to be learned, both from the struggle and how it was won, and from the way things have happened when everybody thought it is impossible for the black and white to join together and one man, one vote and so on. It is surprising that there has been no effect whatsoever on the Palestinian or Israeli societies.
Raja, you said something very fascinating about imagination at one point. When towards the end you talked of Edward's appeal to music and imagination, so on. But at one point, a few minutes before that, you pointed out something about how once one was given rights, it would release imagination. And that's very interesting because, one tends to think, imagination is sort of relatively unfettered. Certain things can create possibilities of action and so on, but imagination one can always have. Even when. So there was something very interesting about bringing together the power of law to actually release a much more specific notion of imagination. And so I thought maybe you and Badia could say something about that.
I think I'm basing this really on my own experience. It took a lot of effort on my part to begin to imagine a different reality and to realize how much I had internalized the borders and the strange fragmentation and distorted geography of the place. It really took a great effort. And once I was able to reimagine that, I realized that, in fact, perhaps, the law has its limitations and you can't have an influence through law except if there is a leadership that is responsive, really. And so perhaps I changed gear and started thinking in terms of a better role for me would be as a writer, helping people through my writing to imagine a new reality. And I did this in part in my book on my great-great-uncle Najib Nassar, who was, it's called Rift in Time, who had been escaping during the First World War from the Ottoman authorities and went through the land. And the land, for him, did not have any meaning as Palestine or Israel. Of course, Israel exists, nor Palestine, or Lebanon or Syria and Jordan. And he just went from one of these places to the other, and I followed his route and realized that in order to follow the route of that just 100 years ago, I had to pass through so many borders and break through in my mind the scheme of things that had become ingrained in me, which I had taken and absorbed without even thinking about it. And so at one point I was in the Rift Valley and realized that, this is the Rift Valley. It's a valley that stretches from southern Turkey all the way to Mozambique. And it doesn't know these borders and limitations and so on. And here I was looking south and north and thinking, oh, there is Israel, there is Jordan, there is Lebanon, and how do I get from one place to the other? It was only because I had absorbed all of this and failed in my imagination to think otherwise that I had become a victim of the present reality. And it was very important to rid myself of that and release my imagination. And now I think perhaps writers and people who have the means to write and speak should do more of this and should work on encouraging people to imagine a new reality, and that would be a beginning.
Maybe we can take one last question, if that's okay. Oh.
One of the wonderful things about your writing is the sense of the land that you give, the beauty of the land, and how it's in peril, no matter from whom, I think, whether it's the settlers or whether it's modernization. And since this land is so important to so many different cultures and traditions, no matter what government, or if there is one country eventually, how would you imagine keeping some of that beauty, some of that history, some of that, the fact that when you look at a stone wall, you don't know whether the Romans built it or the medieval inhabitants, or it was built yesterday, you really can't tell. Would you envision some sort of status that would preserve it, or would you envision educating the young to the importance of preserving some of this beauty?
Well, at the present time, it's all dependent on which side do you belong to, how do you look, and what do you preserve, and how do you like it to be. There's also the politicization of development, so that the settlers who claim to be in love with the land are in a race to build as fast as possible without taking into consideration the contours of the land and without preserving the beauty of the land. So once there is a new situation, I think all of that would end, and we would have development, because it's inevitable, but more relaxed, in a relaxed manner. And we would consider how to preserve the land while developing it. So, for example, one of the things that has made life also in the cities in the West Bank difficult is that they are all confined to a small area of land. So Ramallah, where I live, has become very much reminiscent of Nazareth, which is the only Arab Palestinian city in Israel, which is so crowded and so inconvenient for people living in it, because it is not relaxed. It is a large number of people confined in a small area because they are not allowed to develop naturally around. And likewise in the villages in the occupied territories. They are all confined, and rather than use the land around them in a sensible, well-studied way that would preserve the beauty and nature of villages, now they are building several floors up, and they're beginning to look. Actually, they're beginning to look like the Palestinian villages in the Galilee, which look more artificial than the Jewish towns and villages.
Okay, I think with that we'll stop and thank Reza for his talk.